Hello, my name is Yvonne Gezinhas. I am your Tamach Treaty Coordinator, and I work for the 5 nations that form Tamach Treaty Association. That is Songhees, Malahat, Beecher Bay, Sooke, and Snanawas. Today I'm here to explain from our point of view why we are in treaty. Well, what is the problem? Why did we go into treaty in the first place? What's wrong with our current way of life? Why can't we just get up and improve our own lives? The biggest problem is our member nations are funded by the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, known as INAC or Indian Affairs. The funding levels that they give your nations are inadequate. They are extremely low and therefore keep your nation at poverty levels. Now that means things like infrastructure, the water, the sewage, the roads, the community halls, the administration buildings, they are all at far less quality than your neighboring municipalities. You ever wonder when you're going down a road and you look at your neighboring municipality and you see them with paved roads, you see them with nice administration offices. They don't have quality of water as an issue. They know their water is going to be fresh. They know they have a sewer system in place. We don't have that. Nor do we receive enough money to look after our housing situations. Most of you know of someone or you actually live in a house that has a mold problem. Most of our older houses are in sad need of renovations. Now, your houses aren't like that because the nation doesn't care. It's because your nation doesn't receive enough funding from the federal government. We have inadequate housing, we have inadequate infrastructure, we don't have enough money to run our administration building. All of those setbacks lead us to inadequate health. Our health in general in our communities is much lower than the average Canadian community, the average Canadian family. When our health is lower, our education is lower, our social issues are a bigger concern. We have a lot more personal problems. So how did we get to this state? How did we end up being, in effect, a ward of the Canadian government? Well, back in first contact, when we ran into the first non-native person, it was in our nature to help the people that came. They needed help. They needed help to establish themselves, become healthy, become as successful as we did. So as our nature guides us, off we went to help them. As time went by, more and more of their rules, their priorities, and their vision of what was right was imposed on us. Time goes by some more, and pretty soon we found ourselves living on reserve land, little parcels of land, and we found the non-natives had somehow wrestled control away from our leadership. Now that's not to say our leadership didn't sit around and let this happen. The problem was maybe we trusted too much. We've been in contact with the non-native people for almost 200 years. Our chiefs, all of the leaders, our elders before us, always brought forth the issue that this land is ours, we are stewards of the land, we are to take care of it. We're to look after our families, look after each other. So here we are with our inadequate funding, inadequate infrastructure, inadequate housing, and therefore inadequate health. So why don't we improve our way of life? Why don't we go off and create our own businesses, get our own ventures going? It's difficult for us to dig ourselves out of the current state that we're in. We are faced with a lot of bureaucracies within Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. We find that Indian and Northern Affairs Canada make it nearly impossible for us to manage our lands. Anytime we want to do an economic venture, we have to send a request into Ottawa to make sure that they approve these ventures on reserve land. This can take, on average, about 18 months. By that time, our potential investors, potential partners, have given up and moved on. We found that most of our economic ventures have been blocked. We also don't anticipate Indian Affairs Canada to phone us up and say, you know what, we haven't sent you enough money in order to be successful. We're going to send you a whole bunch more. That's not going to happen. Nor do we ever see Indian Affairs phoning us up and saying, my goodness, we're controlling your lands far too much, and you're never able to get your economic ventures up and running. That's not going to happen either. If that were to happen, they'd do themselves out of a job. And that's what we find with bureaucracies. They always need to protect their jobs. So what are we doing about it? Over the past 200 years, all of the leadership have lobbied, saying that this land is ours. We have the right to manage it. We have the right to care for our families. We have the right to govern our nations. So this lobbying, the meetings that our leadership have had over the past 200 years continued, and they still continue today. Now, 15 years ago, as a result of a very heated summer, the summer of '92, where blockades were all across BC, all across Canada for that matter, the leadership continued to press for our right to self-government, our right to manage our own lands. Around about that time, the BC Treaty Commission was formed. At the same time, the Tumut Treaty Association was formed. Negotiators were appointed for each of the nations. They were told, go out and get the best treaty available for your member nation. The first option that we looked at is one that is offered through the BC Treaty Commission. It's the Modern Day Treaty. So what does that Modern Day Treaty do? It sets out our right to self-government and our right to manage our lands and resources. So what does that phrase mean? First off, let me explain that once we get into the end stages of these negotiations, our Tumut Treaty Association was separated into 5 separate treaties. One for Songhees, one for Sooke, one for Malahat, one for Beecher Bay, and one for Snanawas. The treaty will set out lands and resources that will form part of the agreement between BC, Canada, and that Tumut member nation. The treaty will also set out the right to govern all of those resources and the right to govern ourselves. What will the treaty look like? How will it be laid out? The first part of the final agreement will explain how our treaty will fit inside the Canadian government. It will explain that this treaty is protected by the Constitution of Canada. It'll also explain that our treaty will follow the Canadian Human Rights Code. It'll also give a historical overview of that Tumut Nation, and along with all of the other legal context on how we're going to fit into the Canadian world as it is today. And then it's going to be broken into about 4 sections. One of the sections will be about our land. What parcels of land will we take as treaty settlement land? How will the existing interests on our reserves be addressed? Now that's something like a CP, a certificate of possession. How will that land be transferred into another form of title for that person or family? It'll talk about expropriation. If either government ever has to take some of the treaty settlement land, what will the terms be for that? If there's going to be any parks within our treaty settlement land, how will that be managed? We're also going to have maps clearly outline what our land will look like. How will people be able to access our lands, and when will they be able to access it? Our treaty will also have a section on resources. We'll take forestry as an example. How will we manage the forests? Who will have ownership of the forests? How will the timber processing be? How will we be able to market our logs? All of that's going to be in detail so that the people who follow us will be able to clearly see how we're going to manage the forestry. We'll also have sections on water, wildlife, birds. All of that will be in the resources section. One of the other sections is going to be governance. How will our elected officials manage the nation? What will the rules be that they will follow? That's known as the Constitution and bylaws. How will they reach their decisions? What will the bylaws look like? How will it work with other nations around us and with municipalities? Another section will be fiscal. How will the funding be provided? How will programs and services be delivered? Now, in some of these topics, we're going to have protected under the Constitution of Canada. We'll have it mentioned here. There will be funding. The actual funding explanation will be in the side agreements, because those will have to be modified every once in a while to allow for the cost of living, any additional programs we choose to take on. We'll go into much more detail in that in other presentations. So now to recap, we see why we're in treaty. We just simply have inadequate funding, inadequate infrastructure, inadequate health. We have to change the way we are. It's difficult to do that under the present system. We have to seek an alternate. The first option that your negotiators have taken on is through the BC Treaty Commission with the modern day treaty. We're looking at a modern day treaty now, and it's going to give us the right to govern ourselves, the ownership of land and resources, and how we will govern that, as well as to deliver the programs and services that we choose to do. The treaty document has 4 main points: the lands, the resources, the governance structure, and the funding, how all of that is going to be done. It's going to be inside the final agreement, and it's going to be in the side agreements. So now we see how the treaty is going to look. How is it going to be managed? How are we going to manage our nation after treaty? Well, the first decision maker are going to be our citizens. Who are going to be our members? Everyone on our Indian registry, on our band membership list now, has the right to be a member in our treaty group. Every person who has ties to your nation from their grandparents or even their parents has rights to be a member of your nation. And any person who has been adopted by your parents, yourself, or your grandparents has the rights to be there. We also need to show a cultural connection to your community, which we can go into more detail in another presentation. Now, members of your nation will be eligible to vote in the election of your government. What will your government look like? It's expected that we will have a chief and council, very much like we have today. And I say expected because we haven't written the Constitution, that's the rules to live by for your chiefs and councils. We haven't written that yet. That is in the next stage of the treaty negotiations. We expected that your chief and councils will be voted in by elections, and those chiefs and councils will be making decisions based on the rules that you've written. Rules to follow, rules to govern. Now, those rules to live by will be known as the Constitution of your nation. Along with those rules, the Constitution, you'll likely draw bylaws. Bylaws are other rules for your governing nation to follow. We also expect that you'll have a governing office, very much like your band office looks now, and similar staff. And of course, your elected officials, your chief and council, will have strong accountability guidelines to follow. That too will be in your Constitution and bylaws that you as the community will draw. We will meet with you after stage 4 and into stage 5 of the treaty process. We'll meet likely at community meetings and start drawing the rules to live by, this Constitution I talk about. So how can we be assured that your elected leadership will be accountable? The accountability guidelines will be drawn in the Constitution. That Constitution will be drawn in what is known as Stage 5 of the BC Treaty process. Your accountability guidelines will be drawn before the effective date of treaty, before we start day one of the treaty. And they will likely be drawn from your Constitution and bylaws. The Constitution and bylaws will be drawn before the final agreement vote, and those Constitution and bylaws will be written by you, the membership. The Constitution and bylaws will be rules to live by and rules to follow for your elected leadership on how to manage your lands, your resources, your money, and how to govern themselves. Along with that, we anticipate that land code will be in place for all of our nations. Now, that land code process also draws up bylaws. Drawing up bylaws in the land code process also includes full participation from the membership of that nation. So we have accountability covered off in many aspects, and it will be in place before you vote at the final treaty. So now we have the treaty document. We know that inside of this treaty document and the side agreements, we will have our treaty that says how much land we will own, what resources we will own and or manage, what type of governing rights do we have and how that will be delivered, as well as what programs and services and what type of funding will we receive for all of this. So how are we going to get the money? We will be negotiating 5-year agreements for our treaty, and those funds are issued annually. How much money will we need? Well, right now we are doing some huge studies on programs and services. What are we doing in health now? What more would we like to do? What are we doing in education? Can we do more? What are we doing in community projects? Can we do more? You'll see us going to all of your band offices and asking you information like that. Once we determine what it is that each nation needs, your negotiators will have a great negotiating tool. Now, along with that funding, along with the treaty and our right to govern ourselves, we also take on a huge responsibility of managing ourselves in a good way. Now, that means we can't miss any reporting procedures. If we do miss one, we can't phone them up and say, oops, we forgot, but send the money anyway. We have a huge accountability process here, which is why we need to get our capacity built up with our staff. We have to make sure that we're going to manage the lands and resources in the best way possible. When we negotiate our funding agreements every 5 years, we take into consideration how much money we need for the program. Did the cost of living go up? Did the inflation factor happen? Have we decided to take on another program? Do we need more funds for that? That's all done once every 5 years. So where are we now? 15 years ago, Tamach was formed. Your negotiators were appointed. They were told to go out and get the best deal possible for their members and for their nation. Over the past 5 years, our negotiations have accelerated tenfold. We, Tamach, are now known as a lead table. That means we are one of 5 main groups in BC to negotiate their treaty. We have 3 groups in front of us. We have the Malnouth, we have the Tsawwassen, and the Lheidli Dene. So what will Tamach do when we get the land in cash offer? Well, your negotiators are aware that the first land in cash offer is going to be like buying a car. The first offer is going to be ridiculous. We know that they will offer too little land, they will offer too little cash. And what are we going to do about that? Well, the negotiators have done a lot. The first thing they did was they have studied every parcel of land within the traditional territories of each of our 5 nations. We've had every parcel assessed. We've looked at the highest and best use of everything available. We've looked at the private lands. We're checking to see if there were any willing sellers. We are also doing some program and services studying, and that's where you see us going into your band offices to check to see what services and programs you have in place. And are there any other programs and services that your nation may want to undertake? So now we've taken a look at why we're in treaty. What is a treaty? It's a process for us to get our own right to govern, land, resources, and the money to manage ourselves and those lands and resources. How everything is going to be managed will be inside two main documents, the final treaty, the final agreement, and its side agreements. We've taken a look at how we will govern ourselves. Our members will elect a chief and council. That chief and council will follow rules to live by known as the Constitution and bylaws. They will then carry out the management of everything in our treaty. We're preparing for the land and cash offer. By doing that, we've studied all of the lands available. We've studied all of the programs that we need, and we're also taking a look at our current infrastructure. What shape are our roads in? What shape are the buildings in? What is our housing situation like? What's our education system like? We're taking a look at all of that and preparing ourselves for this land and cash offer. So when is it going to happen? The governments are currently meeting between themselves, called bilateral talks between Canada and British Columbia. Now it is their obligation to come up with a land and cash offer together. With the amount of talks they're doing, the amount of time they've been conducting their talks, we anticipate a land and cash offer to come between the months of June, July, or August of 2008. Now keep in mind, the first land and cash offer that we get will be far too low for your negotiators to even consider accepting. We expect the negotiations will start again. We say it's too low, we show them why it's too low. We anticipate that we will reach the agreement in principle by the fall or winter of 2008. Now, the agreement in principle is a rough draft of what the final agreement will look like. The agreement in principle is a non-binding agreement. You are not bound to it, but it's to give you a rough idea on what the treaty will look like. Once we reach a land and cash offer that your negotiators can live with, we've negotiated most of the treaty, we can bring the rough draft forward for consideration. Now, how is the agreement in principle approved? Well, you know, at first, when I first started going to community meetings, I said the agreement in principle would be done by a vote. And that's the way most of the nations were thinking. But now we're taking a look at the nations that have gone ahead of us. The three nations, the Lheidli, the Tsawwassen, and the Malnuth, they have all approved the agreement in principle by way of a BCR by their chiefs and councils. So what do we do when we've reached an agreement in principle? How do we complete the agreement in principle stage? The treaty, our treaty, says that a process to reach the agreement in principle will be decided by chief and council. We have found that most of the nations at our level of negotiations have had their agreement in principle ratified by a band council resolution, BCR, by your chief and council. Now, why is this? Two reasons. The agreement in principle is non-binding. It's not legally binding for you. It's to give you a rough draft of how the treaty will look. You won't be held to it. The other issue is timeliness. Other nations at the same level of negotiations that we are have all found that there are benefits to having a BCR passed. Why? Timing. Timing is crucial right now. There are critical financial offers that were on the tables for the three treaty groups that are ahead of us. Some of those critical financial offers have been taken off of the negotiation table. Will there be more financial offers that are taken off of the table as time goes by? If we wait too long, will more and more stuff come off of the treaty table? We fear that may be the case. The negotiators feel that timing is crucial. So what do we do after the agreement in principle stage? Well, if we are given direction to proceed, your negotiators will then start doing the fine-tuning of the agreement in principle. That means to put in the final figures for the final agreement. How much money will there be? How much land will there be? How will it be governed? We will go through every chapter that we have and make sure that we haven't missed one issue. We'll even do spell checks. We'll cross-reference it with other treaties that are ahead of us or other treaty groups that are working beside us and make sure we haven't missed anything. Your negotiators will continue going over this treaty time and again, and once they feel they have negotiated the best deal they possibly can, they will then bring it to you for your consideration. During these final agreement negotiations, we'll also look at the side agreements. How much money will be delivered for a program? What service are we willing to deliver? What is the best program and service? We'll also be drawing the constitution and bylaws for each member nation, and that will be done with your direct participation. We need your thoughts, your ideas, your wants, and your desires of your nation. We need to work that all into rules to live by for your chiefs and councils, for your governing bodies, known as the constitution and bylaws. We will also be negotiating a fiscal financing arrangement, and that's going to be in a side agreement similar to this. It's going to talk about how much money we will receive, when, how often, and what programs will we manage. What programs will we eventually come to manage once our capacity is up. All of these details will be all ironed out. So what will happen then? During that time, we will be having in-depth community meetings, DVDs, newsletters, explaining what this entire treaty means to you and to your family. This document is legally binding and therefore requires your vote. Any member of your nation who is 18 years or older will be asked to vote on whether or not they think this treaty is the best deal for their family and themselves. If this final agreement is accepted, then we'll move on to the implementation stage, how we will implement our treaty. So during this journey of treaty negotiations, what have we learned? We have learned how to communicate with the two governments. We have learned how their legislation works, how to get inside of the legislation or how to work around it, how to make it work for us. Most of all, we've learned how to work with industry. And you know what? They aren't as bad as we thought. Industry is willing to speak to most nations. They know what side their bread is buttered on. We have learned how other First Nations work. Some of those First Nations are in a treaty process, some are not in a treaty process, but over these 15 years, we've been able to go and take a look at a lot of other treaties in place or a lot of other First Nations who are managing their own lands. We've learned a lot there. Now, 15 years ago when Tamawh was formed, we were told to go out and get the best deal possible for our citizens. The first option was a modern-day treaty through the BC Treaty process. Along that journey, we stopped and studied a lot of other governing ways that other First Nations have. Some of those other options include land code, how you can manage your lands and still remain under the Indian Act, which gives you the tax exemption. There is the self-government agreement, like Sechelt, how they govern themselves and still stay under the Indian Act, again, for the tax exemption. There's the West Bank Agreement. For those of you who have ever been to Kelowna and to West Bank, you see how hugely successful that nation has become by managing their own lands and governing themselves. What your negotiators are considering is possibly a combination of all four of those. Perhaps some of the agreements we've reached inside of treaty, maybe we could look at a portion of land code. Why don't we take a look at the self-governing agreement that has been set up by some nations like Sechelt? Let's take a deeper look at the West Bank arrangement. How did they become so successful? Those are just a few of the things that the negotiators have learned in this journey of achieving a treaty or achieving the best deal possible. So what are the next steps? We're going to continue working on this modern treaty. We will bring it right through to the end of the agreement in principle stage, or hopefully to the end of the final agreement stage. Remember, you will make that final decision on the treaty. At the same time, we'll continue to look at other options, or a compilation of all of the options together. Maybe we'll take a bit here, a bit there. While we're also negotiating for this treaty, we will continue to build the capacity for our membership, for our current staff, and for those to come, to make sure we can manage our lands and resources to the best possible way we can for ourselves, our grandchildren, and our grandparents. The biggest goal that your negotiators have is the opportunity for our members, our family, our children, to achieve the same successes that other Canadians do in this country. While doing this, we also anticipate that we'll continue to protect our lands and resources the best possible way we can. So what is your job in all of this? Your job is to make yourself versed on the issues, to totally understand how the lands will be managed, how the resources will be managed, how the governance process will be carried out, how the funding arrangements will be carried out. What will the rules for our chief and council be like? How will you draw their governing rules? Will our capacity be up and running, ready to manage ourselves? You make yourself well versed on all of these issues, and once you understand these issues, you won't be doing this on your own. We as your staff and your negotiators will be coming out to your communities as often as it takes to explain this treaty process to you. And when the time comes for you to vote, make that decision. Is this the best deal for you and your family? Make that decision based on the facts. That's your job.